So this week we get to chapter 18. The quote that I want to share today, this is from Brene Brown. If you're familiar with her work, I just happen to be reading Rising Strong right now. I basically anything of hers that you can read, do read. It's completely worth it. And this is just, sometimes you read something or come across something that just strikes you. And this was my experience with this quote of hers. Love is the last thing we need to ration in this world. So that's coming in the context of what, she does a lot of work on vulnerability. And so the idea then in Rising Strong, and the subtitle of the book is The Reckoning, the Rumble, the Revolution. So it's that idea that we have to be in the arena and deal with our stuff, and then work with those who are willing to be in the arena and go through that reckoning, which is then there's the kind of the rumble and the unsettling part in order to get to the other side, where there is new life and new hope. And so I think that's such a key idea that love is the last thing we need to ration in this world. Now, for some of us, it's very easy, and it just kind of comes naturally to offer a loving, caring presence. For others of us, it's a challenge. That maybe loving wouldn't be the first word that jumps to someone's mind. But there's the opportunity for us to be pretty uninhibited in exhibiting our love for others. Because vulnerability is something that, although culturally we're typically taught that, and I'll speak especially as a man in our culture, that vulnerability is a sign of weakness and not a sign of strength. To say that if you're vulnerable, what you need to do is try to present yourself as invulnerable as possible, because otherwise you're just gonna be seen as weak, as less than, as incapable, as whatever else. But truly, to be able to understand our vulnerability and to embrace that and to work with it is a sign of strength, because you can't work through that if you're not if you don't have something in you that is helping move you through that, because it is a pretty countercultural thing. And I don't think it's just men that experience that as well. I think everyone in this room has experienced, and everyone who's online has experienced that, where we're supposed to put on a show that we've got all of our stuff all put together. And that's very rarely the case. And so maybe especially as a Christian community, we can be a place and a people where we call, Luther always says, to call a thing what it is, and to say that that's a lie, that we don't actually have our stuff put together, and we never will have our stuff put together, and it's okay to not be okay together. But we'll see perhaps in this story of Daniel and some of the dynamics of the exile, how it's a challenge through all of it. So we get to Daniel in the exile this week. Daniel's a fascinating book. So I'll just start by talking about some of the just kind of the basics of the book and how it's structured and what it's about. Talk about the reality of exile for a little bit, and then just kind of walk through one of my absolute favorite stories in the Bible, and it happens to be Daniel 3. So we'll start by looking at the background and setting. These notes are on the handout as well. I know it's kind of small up on the screen, but this just gets it onto one screen. So the story is set within the years 606 to 536 BCE. So that's kind of the time frame when it is. Like most of these stories, probably written later than that. So if you think about that, so often we think about the Bible and think that like they're recording it like it's a newspaper. But very often it's reflecting back. That's the book of Genesis, the book of Exodus. It's always looking back. But we understand that in our own day and age because we're closer to it. So if you think about a show like Stranger Things, it's set in the early to mid 80s, but it's coming out now. But we understand that that's the time and place. Or, so that's for one audience. Or the show Bonanza, if that makes sense. No one thought it was the Wild West when new episodes of that show were being produced. So just think about that as it's a story being told and set in the past. The structure of the book, it's really a bifurcated book. So chapters 1 through 6 could be called the tales of the Babylonian court, because they're taking place in exile in Babylon. So these are narratives. These are the familiar stories. Then when we get to chapters 7 through 12, these are the visions of Daniel, and it's the only full-blown apocalypse that's in the Old Testament. An apocalypse is a word that gets used in our culture, and it seems to be a very scary word because of how it gets used. But that's really, apocalypse is just a genre of literature that is unfamiliar to us. It's kind of passed out of existence in most times, so we don't do that. But apocalypse is a word, and you've probably heard this before, but it's worth reminding. It just means unveiling or revealing. So, like the book of Revelation is an apocalypse, and we think it's all this hidden stuff, and it's not about hiding; it's about exposing. So, it's that there are these grand visions that are a part of it. There's really nothing in this chapter of the story that has the apocalyptic part of the book of Daniel. This is just kind of for your own knowledge to have in the back of your mind when you engage Daniel subsequently. For the composition of the book, it's a very interesting book in that in its original form, chapter 1 was written in Hebrew, which is the language that the rest of the Old Testament was written in. But then chapters 2 through 7 were written in Aramaic, and then chapters 8 through 12 were back in Hebrew. So it's very interesting, and scholars don't quite know why the language switched, because it doesn't even align with the structure of the book either, but just something for any of us to know. And then the last note, just about the background and setting, is that the final form of the book of Daniel probably came together shortly before it was before the year 164 BCE. So scholars also think this is the newest book of the Old Testament. That its final form came sometime in the 2nd century BCE, because one of the things that the visions of Daniel point to are the death of the emperor Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Tremendous name. I wouldn't name my kid that, but to have a Roman numeral in the middle of your name is great. Not enough of that happen. Roman numerals get at the end, but to do in the middle, that's really something else. Because the details of the coming death of Antiochus IV Epiphanes were wrong in the book of Daniel from what actually happened. So that's why the thought was, because it's pointing to him, to his death as well. Because it's in the end, it's a book to offer a word of hope to those who are in exile, and so that's where it's coming from, to offer those words of hope. One of the things I talked about before is just some of the meta-narratives, so the big picture frameworks in Scripture that help us make sense of our own lives of faith. So we see these meta-narratives in Scripture, then that help us make sense of what of our lives and of Scripture. So one of those is bondage or slavery and Exodus. So there's that captivity and then the Exodus. And we see this, of course, in the book of Exodus, where the people of God are enslaved by Pharaoh in Egypt, and then we've got the entire story of the Exodus, the freedom. And so that's even the gospel writer Luke uses that framework of Exodus and talks about Jesus coming, his ministry, his resurrection as an Exodus event. So it's this meta-narrative to say that God is working to free people from what's holding them captive. Another one, and this is perhaps the most commonly thought of one in the Christian church, is sin and forgiveness. To say that there's some sort of brokenness or sin that we experience, and then there's this freedom of forgiveness that's offered. And so we see that, of course, in the story of Jesus, but it's also, as we've been paying attention, it's not like grace got invented when Jesus was born. Forgiveness wasn't invented when Jesus came. That's always been a part of God's character and who God is. So sin and forgiveness. And then the one that we're hitting on now is exile and return. So exile and return. So we're at the point now where the people are in exile, the Assyrian exile that Israel was taken into, and then the Babylonian exile, which is where we get the stories of King Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel, or what's going on, and then the return. So that's the exile is being taken away from what was normal, comfortable, kind of understood to be what life was about, and then return is being brought back into that sort of reality. So with this idea of exile, and I think that's actually one, and I'm going to share from, there's the quote, it's on the handout because I think it's worth just kind of unpacking a little bit by the author Michael Frost in his book called Exiles, and the subtitle is Living Missionally in a Post-Christian Culture. And so this excerpt both roots us in what's going on at this point in the biblical narrative and helps direct us to how this part of the biblical narrative can help us make sense of where we find ourselves today. So I'll just read what you've got on your sheet, and it's on the screen here as well. After an agonizing siege in which it was the only city in Judah to resist the Babylonian might, Jerusalem finally was razed in the summer of 587 BCE by Nebuchadnezzar's superior forces. And then began the citizenry humiliation of living as exiles on the foreign soil of their conquerors. Carted east in a massive repatriation program, the Jews were allowed to live in their own settlements in the capital and other Babylonian cities. They were free to build houses, earn a living, and observe their own customs and religion, but they could not return home to their desolated capital. Jehoiakim and his family were, quote unquote, guests in Nebuchadnezzar's household, and some Jews rose to high positions in public service. Many became so accustomed to life in Babylon that they refused to return to Jerusalem, even when much later there was an opportunity to do so. They had sunk roots in the foreign soil, and Jerusalem held no allure for them. So that's putting that, the biblical story, explaining kind of what's going on. Then Frost goes on to say this. The experience that faced the Jewish exiles mirrors the church's experience today. In fact, the biblical metaphor that best suits our current times and faith situation is that of exile. Just like the Jewish exiles, the church today is grieving its loss and is struggling with humiliation. The ground has slipped out from under the church. It has lost its footing and needs, as Walter Brueggemann puts it, to express a resentful sadness about what was and now is not and never will be again. The passing of Christendom. Now, Christendom is just this assumption that kind of the Christian narrative is the overarching one that everyone kind of understands or lives by. And there's, whether that's good or bad or in a different reality is another discussion, but this is the idea that that's not the current reality. And whether it should be or not, again, a different discussion. It's just saying that's not, that things have changed. So the passing of Christendom might be compared to the fall of Jerusalem, and there is no going back. Exiles feel like a motherless child, abandoned, rootless, vulnerable, orphaned. Brueggemann cites biblical material such as Lamentations as expressing the honest sadness of an exilic people. But most pertinently, he warns that the danger in exile is to become so preoccupied with self that one cannot step outside oneself to rethink, reimagine, and redescribe larger reality. Such self-preoccupation very rarely produces energy, courage, or freedom. What exiles yearn for is an invitation to live freely, dangerously, and tenaciously in a world where faith does not have its own way. And here lies the root of the problem of the church today. Victimized by nostalgia and buffeted by fear, the church is focused too much on merely holding the small plot of ground that it currently occupies to confidently imagine a robust future. The result is a retreat into some fundamentalist us versus them model, rather than an endlessly cunning, risky process of negotiation. It is worth noting that Michael Frost wrote this in 2006. And he's drawing on the work of Walter Brueggemann from Brueggemann's work called Cadences of Home that came out in 1997. So this is not news to anyone who's been paying attention. This is, a generation or two in the works. And so the idea here, though, is this idea of exile, that there's something that we've been taken away from as the church in some way, shape, or form. And then the response, and what Frost is saying, is that rather than either kind of navel-gazing or just saying, we just kind of want back what was, is what does it look like to rethink, reimagine, and redescribe a larger reality? What might God be calling us forth into? And it's that idea of a faithful imagination, which is really where things can happen. So that rather than having nostalgia and fear control the day, to take those risks to reimagine what life with God in this world can look like. And so that's kind of where he says that if we get wound up in self-preoccupation, that gets us nowhere, rather than thinking about what is a faithful response to where we find ourselves. What leads us out of exile? This was exacerbated, of course. We had an exile experience. March of 2020, we had this pandemic show up. And so that was an experience of exile for us. And so it's very interesting because it's a scary time. Scary time. And there was so much grief. And that grief got expressed in so many different ways. Some helpful and even life-giving. And in a lot of those ways, the grief came out sideways or in every which way and landed. So I cannot imagine what it took to be a teacher through the pandemic or to work in healthcare through the pandemic. Just thinking about how people in those sorts of lines of work were treated and what they had to go through in order to simply try to be faithful to what they were doing, for instance. So we have that experience, and then the idea is after exile, we don't just reset. Things don't go back to the way they were. That's, of course, we understand that's kind of what we clamor for. But what we'll see in the biblical narrative in the coming weeks is that when the people returned from exile, what they found was not what they left. And that's true of any exile experience. After the return, it doesn't look the same as what we left. So questions that happen in the return from exile is what remnant is there? What does that look like? Because that was Frost's thing, talking about those who were in Babylon and those who did not return. Because, you know what? Life was better in Babylon. They didn't really want to go back. They didn't want to return. And then it's figuring out, what's life going to look like now? And then, just wondering, where is God? How do we know? And where do we go from here? Because going back is never an option. There's return, but return is different than going back. What's interesting, and more research will be done in the coming years as well, but I don't know, do we say post-pandemic? I don't even know what we do. Yes? Okay. Ruth says yes. Regardless, today. So what's interesting is we know that the life in the church looks different now than it did prior to March 2020 for any number of reasons. What's very interesting is the research that's being done about who is not coming back, because it's across the board. Numbers are down in every church everywhere. And any church that says they're not needs to refigure their accounting a little bit. But what's interesting is who's chosen not to come back, or at least not come back yet. Oftentimes the thought is, well, it's young people because, they just, for whatever reason, I've always been the young person in my career. So it's like, I've always been the symbol of who's ruining the church. At every call I've been in, someone's saying, well, you're actually kind of ruining the church because you're here. I'm like, well, thank you. I'm happy to be here. But the generation that has not come back in greatest numbers is baby boomers. 22% of baby boomers quit church during or after the pandemic. So, and that's just, so what does that mean then? That's the next research question. Why is that? What's happening? But percentage-wise, that's the biggest percent of any living generation of people who have chosen to become an alumnus of the church. So anyway, these are just things because that the reality of exile that we hear about in the book of Daniel, for instance, can be a helpful framework for us as we think about what do we do where we find ourselves in our lives of faith. Because we have these models of Daniel and then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that can inspire us and give us hope through it all. So we've got a couple patterns that happen in the book of Daniel. This comes from Philip Davies. So one is an interpretation story where this is the structure of it. If you read through the chapter in the story, if you're familiar with the book of Daniel, you know where this happens, but it's a familiar structure that is in other places of literature, but happens here in the book of Daniel. First thing, the king has a vision or a dream. The wise men of the king's court cannot interpret its meaning. Then the third part is the hero emerges and gives the interpretation. The hero then is rewarded. And then the last part typically is the king learns that the hero's God is all-powerful. So that's a typical structure. Is there another figure we studied maybe a couple months ago who may have fit into this structure? Anyone come to mind? I think I heard Joseph, yeah. Because Joseph interpreted the dreams and fits pretty well into this structure, and you look at where Joseph was able to land as a result. The other story is the deliverance story, and that's what we're going to dig into in Daniel 3 today, where the king issues an order that commands, in this case, the Jews to worship an idol. Second part is the hero or heroes are discovered disobeying. They refuse to comply with the order and are prepared for execution. They're delivered, they're rewarded, their enemies are punished, and the king learns that the hero's God is all-powerful. So those are just a couple of the two structures that we see in the first half of the book of Daniel. Just to know that that's the rhythm of what's going on. You'll see on your sheet too that there are just questions that you can think about, especially chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4 are fascinating, and each kind of self-contained units as well that you can kind of ask, who are the characters? To do a little character study. Who's in there? What do we learn about them? Who are they? What do they do? What's the scene? What's the setting? What's going on in the midst of the story? What's the outcome of this story as well? So I do want to just take the last thing I want to do in our time together is walk through Daniel 3. And I know it's a long story, but a couple things that happen in it. One is it helps us practice some of the things that we've been noting about the Old Testament, especially the repetition. So if you remember, kind of one of the ways to carefully read the Bible is to see when there are these moments of repetition that it means something. There's a reason. It's not just poor editing, but there's a reason to have the repetition that usually highlights something, or there's something that's notable about having these things repeated. The other thing is it's kind of a funny story. If we allow it to be, if we allow it to be funny, it's kind of funny. The repetition helps serve that. That's why reading it out loud is actually more interesting than reading it quietly. It's also why, like the Veggie Tales, one of the best Veggie Tales was Rack, Shack, and Benny. It's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Rack, Shack, and Benny, and they do a great job. And what it captures really well is the buoyancy of the story. To say that if we take it on its terms, it's in enjoying that and allowing ourselves to catch the humor, then that gets us to a deeper place. So often we're kind of, again, it's that vulnerability thing, because humor cracks us open. Because we know that tears of laughter and tears of sorrow are never very far apart. So we know that's part of it. But humor, we know, cracks us open. But if we have to be invulnerable, and then we think, if I'm supposed to be invulnerable, that's the way to be, then also Scripture is supposed to be really important. So that means I can't think it's funny. Which then we often miss the point when that happens. So anyway, I just want to read through it. I'll put the words up on the screen because, again, it's one of my favorite stories. And Daniel gets all the credit, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are by far my favorite characters in the book. So King Nebuchadnezzar made a golden statue whose height was 60 cubits. Now, a cubit is 1.5 feet. So 90 feet tall, whose width was 6 cubits and 9 feet wide. So 90 foot tall. So it's a 9-story statue of gold. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. So, I don't know where you stand on golden statues, but it sounds like an eyesore, if nothing else. That's a big old statue. So, but then King Nebuchadnezzar sent for so here's where that repetition is going to start. The satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to assemble and to come to the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So, they've got like the unveiling, you christen ships. I don't know what you do to statues. But anyway, so all the muckety-mucks showed up, and if you wanted to be seen, that's where you were. So the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces assembled for the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. When they were standing before the statue that Nebuchadnezzar had set up, the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble, you are to fall down and worship the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up." You gotta pledge allegiance to the statue. "Whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire." Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and the entire musical ensemble, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Accordingly, at this time, certain Chaldeans, pay attention to the Chaldeans here. I think they're low-key the bad guys. They came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, now just listen to these brown nosers. "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble shall fall down and worship the golden statue. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These pay no heed to you, O king. They do not serve your gods, and they do not worship the golden statue that you have set up." So we got tattletales. But just, again, think through. In this Babylonian culture, there's this huge statue that's set up, and when when they strike up the band, it's expected that everyone, acts all in one to give honor and respect and worship to this 90-foot tall, 9-foot wide golden statue. There may or may not be any parallels that come to mind for us in our lives. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are tattled on. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought in. So they brought those men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods, and you do not worship the golden statue that I have set up?" It's almost like Nebuchadnezzar has been paying attention to Daniel 1 and 2. But now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble to fall down and worship the statue that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. And who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter. And these next words, I think if we root ourselves in these words, this is exactly what an imaginative faith looks like. Because it's faith, it's not certainty. Because we have to trust. And we have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as the ones who can model this for us. So they're being accused of this, that we're not even going to defend ourselves, and they say this, if, that's an important word here, if our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, let him deliver us. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up. They don't know if God will rescue them or not, but they are not willing to trust in anyone else. Then Nebuchadnezzar was so filled with rage against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face was distorted. I think that's a mild translation. He ordered the furnace heated up 7 times more than was customary. Now, the number 7, it's not like they had the thermometer and it was at like 300 and he turned it up to 2100 or whatever. 7 times just means it was perfectly hot. 7 is a number that signifies completion or perfection. So it was completely hot. It was perfectly hot. So heated up 7 times more than was customary and ordered some of the strongest guards in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to throw them into the furnace of blazing fire. So the men were bound, still wearing their tunics, their trousers, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. Because the king's command was urgent and the furnace was so overheated, the raging flames killed the men who lifted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Just think about what that says about Nebuchadnezzar, too. But the 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound into the furnace of blazing fire. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up quickly. He said to his counselors, was it not 3 men that we threw bound into the fire? They answered the king, true, O king. He replied, but I see 4 men unbound walking in the middle of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the 4th has the appearance of a god. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the door of the furnace of blazing fire and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, get that, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their tunics were not harmed, and not even the smell of fire came from them. Nebuchadnezzar said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. They disobeyed the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that utters blasphemy against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb. Man, Nebuchadnezzar's just going to Nebuchadnezzar, isn't he? and their house is laid in ruins, for there's no other God who's able to deliver in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. But I mean, that thing at the end, it's like a big oopsie. It's maybe someone who's like, had kind of a conversion experience or whatever, and they're just kind of on fire with their faith. But then they're like so intense about it that they haven't quite figured out what it means. And Nebuchadnezzar's kind of got that thing going on because he's still like, well, no, it's the same policies that I'm going to keep, but just in this other way, rather than seeing that the God that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego worship is against that policy of tearing limb from limb and laying houses in ruin and whatever. So anyway, I think that's, again, that picture of their faithfulness and their steadfastness, their trust in God, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to say, if if God is willing, then we'll be saved. But if not, we're still not going to compromise our faith and worship the statue and worship your gods. And so maybe it's worth us thinking about, where does the temptation lie for us to worship the statues? What other gods are calling for our allegiance in the midst of our call to be faithful to the one true God? And are we willing to admit that temptation? And maybe even are we willing to follow the example of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and put ourselves in great personal peril as a witness to this God who we know most fully as Jesus Christ? And so I think there's stuff to work with there as we think about Daniel in exile and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in exile, and even in considering our own experiences of exile as well. So that's what I got. Thanks much. Have a great conversation, and we'll see you soon.